So this is a bit of a spur of the moment decision to make the introduction. I am so moved to do this because I had the wonderful opportunity to hear our speaker earlier today. Peter Vale came and spoke in my international relations class, and it was so excellent that I am thrilled, pleased, and honored to be able to introduce you to him and him to you this evening. So, Peter comes to us from Rhodes University, where he teaches classes of 400 at the intro level. So it is quite a different experience, I'm sure, that he has had here. We are much less formal than that, very intimate and small gatherings. So he has agreed to speak for around 40 minutes. So anyway, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Peter Vale. And thanks, Tom Regal, for bringing him here.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I want to start by saying something which we say too seldom in the world. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to Marlborough College. I started a conversation with Tom Regal 24 years ago, and I've always had the sense that these conversations were not complete until I'd sort of visited Marlborough College. And I've realized in the last 2 or 3 days, in a sense, the conversation has only just started. So I look forward to 24 more years of long conversations with Tom Regal, and which will be enriched by this experience of Marlborough College. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. What I thought I would do is talk a little bit about South Africa, and I thought I would start by trying to explain the title of this talk, which is 15 years after the end of Apartheid, and just make the point that this is a year of great anniversaries in South Africa, and I want to point out a few of them to you. It's 100 years this year of the formation of the state of South Africa in 1910. This is 2010, so the state has been in existence for 100 years. It came in the formation, as you know, of 4 provinces, of 3 provinces of Britain and 1 independent Boer republic at the time came together to form the state of South Africa. Now the interesting thing, and I said that to the students today too, is that this event is not being celebrated in the country at all. There is an event of great celebration in South Africa this year, which is the 2010 Soccer World Cup, which will take place, and my prediction is there may or may not be a country after this event takes place. It's 50 years ago since 2 critical events happened in South African history. The first was a visit to the country by the then British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, and he made a very famous speech about decolonization called the Winds of Change speech. And you may remember the Winds of Change speech was essentially the message from the British was colonialism is over, and discrimination is over, and winds of change are coming throughout the continent, and this is the 50th anniversary of the Winds of Change. But it is also the 50th anniversary of another great and tragic South African event, the massacre at Sharpeville, which took place outside Vereeniging, where 46 members of black members, mainly of the organization called the Pan-Africanist Congress, were shot by South African police on that occasion. It's 20 years ago since Mr. F.W. de Klerk made his speech, famous speech on the 2nd of February, 20 years ago, where he announced that he would release Mr. Mandela and unban the organizations that until that state had been banned. And in 2 days' time, on the 11th of February, it's 20 years ago since Mr. Mandela was released from prison. That event, many people in this hall will remember it. Well, perhaps some of the younger people at the back won't remember it. But it was an event that had completely transfixed the world to see a man whose face we had not seen for 27 years emerge from prison. And the rest, as they say, is history. So I do want to talk about some of these events, but I thought that 15 years since South Africa went to the polls in their first election was a good way to sort of test the waters, and that's really what I want to do this evening. I thought the best way to do this was to try and give you a report card with a mix of analysis, because I think our knowledge of South Africa is quite uneven. So what I thought I would do is divide the report card into different subjects: history, economics, politics, sociology, and law, with the warning, of course, that these frames are indicative only. The old truism is that universities have disciplines and the world has real problems. And I was thrilled to read William Edelglass's paper in the most recent Potash Hill, which I stole just outside the President's office this morning, where he talks and makes the same point by saying more elegantly that conceptual knowledge and lived experience are not the same things. So I want to sort of put it in that frame, and you'll forgive me for using these particular framings to try and say something about the country, but it may open up space for some conversation. Let me talk a little bit about history, and I'm not going to go right back to the 100 years of the formation of state, but some recent history which I think is really important in the context of this report card. Firstly, the end of apartheid was a violent experience, but towards the end, South Africa experienced massive violence. And there was real danger, I think, although not many people appreciated, that the country would break up. And I think that it's interesting to try and look at this through the framework of comparative politics. Because at the end of the Cold War, there were three federally inclined multicultural societies in the world: the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and the Republic of South Africa. And one of the really interesting things, if you look at it through this optic, is that of the three, South Africa is the only one who didn't break up. It's interesting too, if you go and carbon date the states: Russia in 1914, Yugoslavia 1918, South Africa 1910, more or less came at the same historical period. And it's really interesting that many people had predicted the breakup of South Africa, that this did not happen. I think if there's one thing to emerge in this history that's really important, was that timing was everything. The end of apartheid came at a particular moment in history, coincidental with the end of the Cold War. I think if we try and explain it, there are many explanations for the end of apartheid. I think perhaps the most important was that there was a stalemate between the forces who were struggling over the future of the country, and in the context of that stalemate, there was no option but to enter forms of negotiation. And we can talk about those negotiations and what happened, if you like, how rationality came to prevail. But the really important thing was that there was a patterning of compromise which took place in the country. And the great story of South Africa since that time has been the story of compromise, and much of what I'll say has to be set against this compromise. One other thing which I think is important, one issue which deserves mentioning in the context of history, is really that South Africa entered in almost uniquely into a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was an attempt to try and set this compromise within a wider understanding to be built between the people of the country. And the TRC process, we call it the TRC process, had its downside. For many people, it was too much based on a religious confessional type of approach led by the extraordinary Desmond Tutu. But it was really an attempt to try and trade off two things: confession for forgiveness. It was not wholly a success, but I remain a great supporter of the TRC, because I did think it allowed South Africans to look each other in the face again. Not a complete system, but it did allow people to look each other in the face again and to begin to arrive at common understandings of a nationhood which is still in the process of being built. The other really important point to recognize is that the end of the Cold War enabled South Africa to, in many ways, draw itself in to a kind of understanding of politics and the nature of society at the end of at the end of that particular historical moment. And for me, the most important thing was that South Africa very much, and I don't say this approvingly, but analytically, that South Africa very much entered into the end of history thesis of Francis Fukuyama. South Africa was drawn along by the idea that history had ended, this neo-Hegelian idea, and that liberal economics and thin form of democracy would be sufficient for the country's future. And my own understanding is that beyond this liberal economics, neoliberal economics, call it what you will, and thin form of democracy, South Africa's history in these last 15 years has essentially been premised on the end of history idea. So South Africa has become, and I'll talk about this later, democratic but a market-inclined country, liberal democratic. Now let me turn a little to economics. It seems to me the essential configuration, and I'm going to come back to this a little later, the essential configuration of South Africa's economic history has not changed. It remains a country categorized by white wealth and black poverty. The 15 years have seen economic growth, roughly 4%, more or less on and off. It's stumbled now to sort of just about 0.8% economic growth. But largely this has been jobless growth, as has happened elsewhere in the world. South Africa is an emerging market, has at times been quite attractive for investment money, but it's really not been sufficient to absorb the large number of people coming onto the job market. So unemployment levels remain very high. In the small city that I live in, which is, I used it in the radio talk this morning, I guess you could compare it to Battleboro, the unemployment levels at some parts, or some people estimate it to be 60% unemployment. Now these are enormous figures. And with that goes the knock-on effects of poverty and disease, which I'll come to in a minute. So this jobless growth has led in many ways to high income in certain areas of the country and increasing poverty. As a result, South Africa has the highest Gini coefficient in the world. The gap between the rich and poor is the highest in the world, probably only matched by Swaziland, which is a small country in South Africa, and Brazil. The redistribution effects of the economy come through a rather narrow tax base. South African tax is mainly paid by the middle class, and the tax base remains extremely narrow, a tax base of roughly 5 million people supporting a country of 44 million. So this has its own dynamic to it. By the way, one of the great success stories of the country has been an enormously efficient tax collection system, which has really been one of the fantastic success stories of the country. So redistribution in the country has relied on one form of black economic empowerment, which has been a system of, if you want to get government business, if you want to get municipal business, if you want to get any business like this, you have to show that your company or your business has involved increasing people from previously excluded groups in this process. Black economic empowerment has in many ways allowed blacks into the economy, but the problem has remained that it has been the rapid advance of small, self-selecting group of people. So what has happened is that a lot of black people have been drawn into the economy, but the extent to which this could be expanded into the mass of the population has not happened. I think this has been the result mainly of a series of financial deals in which white capital, and I'm using this term in a very loose fashion, white capital has allowed black people into the economy through a series of financial deals. So, as a result, essentially, wealth remains largely trapped within the white community, a small but rather vocal and rather flashy black group. But impoverishment remains the essential feature. One of the interesting things and important things about this is that this black group, often called by the market, people who do market research, as the black diamonds, have become in many ways the role models for the country. And so there's a belief amongst a lot of poor people that you can make a quick buck and become a capitalist, or go into tendering for government business, etc., etc., and that there is a quick road to making a lot of money. The second feature, which has been the redistribution element, has been affirmative action, a form of positive discrimination, borrowed essentially from the American experience, which has been access to government jobs inside the universities, inside the public sector, and in the sport, and even into sport. Now, this has led in many ways to transformation of the country in many places, but I think has had a knock-on effect of failing efficiency. I mean, in the efficiency tests in South Africa, there has been a drop-off in efficiency, and this is felt in many ways in terms of people's own acceptance of government services, which are not efficiently as delivered as they might otherwise be. South Africa remains, and this is one or two points about the nature of the South African economy, South Africa remains an exporter of primary products. That's the nature of its economy. It has been quite vocal in the World Trade Organization and in those type of fora, but it remains essentially a producer of primary products. One really important thing to think about is the infrastructure in South Africa. 2 points I would make very quickly. One is that infrastructure has been found wanting in South Africa, particularly in the supply of electricity, and this has quite serious implications for future production. So there is a massive tax coming on all electricity consumers, and the idea is that this tax, in a sense, will set up a series of power stations and enable us to produce the kind of electricity that we're needed. Second is that most of the infrastructure development which has taken place recently has been around the 2010 World Cup. And for the life of me, and I would like someone in this audience to persuade me otherwise, I can't see what the point is of something like 8 new football stadiums in the country faced with the kind of problems that I've tried to suggest. But I look forward to someone trying to persuade. Let me turn to politics very quickly. Nominally, South Africa is a democracy, but it is in fact a one-party dominated state. The opposition is weak and very fragmented. Outside of formal politics or constitutional politics or party politics, opposition is vocal and very good. And there is a strong and very rigorous free press which punches way above its constitutional weight. It really is very effective, and this press is representative of both black South Africans and white South Africans. The dominant party, South Africa's African National Congress, the party of Nelson Mandela, is a revolutionary liberation party based on national lines. To be frank, and I say this as someone who is a great sympathizer of this party, the movement itself, there are poor role models for this kind of party in Africa. The party is in an alliance with a communist party. South Africa remains one of the few countries in the world where the Communist Party is alive and well, and it really is alive and well in South Africa, and very, very vocal. It's sort of trying to discover itself now as very much a social democratic party. And the other group that the ANC are in alliance with, and the alliance is called the Tripartite Alliance, is a labour movement called COSATU, which is the Congress of South African Trade Unions. The ANC dominates this alliance, and if the others left, the ANC would still win any election. So one of the great hopes, or one of the great tragedies, depending on how you look at this, for South African politics is that the Tripartite Alliance would split. And close, very close, 2 years ago, when President Mbeki, who I'll come to in a minute, when President Mbeki was the president, the alliance was in great danger of splitting. One of the reasons that Mbeki left office was in fact that the alliance together pushed Mbeki from office, and we can touch on that. Let me turn to the issue of political leadership, because I think this goes in very much a focus, much more. Am I going too fast? You sure? Can you hear me? Please just say it. Political leadership is, at this stage, I'm bound to say, weak and unstable. And I think this is a result of the domination of the political system for roughly 13 years of Thabo Mbeki, former president. The return of the exiled movements brought, in many ways, squeezed out the domestic politics, the domestic opposition politics in the country through the mass democratic movement or the United Democratic Front, where there had been a cadre of leadership which had been developed. And in many ways, to use a term that comes from South African politics, the insiles, those who were inside the country, abandoned the political project to those who returned to the country. And one of the issues has been that leadership has only been provided from those people who have come from the outside, who returned to South Africa. And Mbeki, of course, returned after 21 years in exile, virtually to become the president of the country. Now, that in and of itself is not a bad thing. The rise of the new president, President Jacob Zuma, was really around contestations of leadership inside the party. Zuma's contestation to power was rather planned. This is not an uncontroversial man, as most people know. He has been accused of relatively deep involvement in one of the worst moments in post-apartheid South African history, the so-called arms deal, where South Africa went out and purchased $3 billion worth of weapons. God only knows who we're going to use these against, including sophisticated submarines and fighter jets. I must say none purchased from the United States. Not for a want of trying, please understand that. But he is implicated somehow in an arms deal, and his closest financial advisor, Mr. Sheikh, has been actually convicted as a result of the arms deal, and there's great suspicion that Mr. Zuma himself has been involved, although no court has delivered a judgment on this, and no court has delivered a judgment on the fact that perhaps President Mbeki, the former president, has also been involved in this. The other issue which I think one is bound to say about President Zuma, who's a man I like, actually, he's a very nice, warm person, compared to the cold, rather academic and rather austere and technicist approach of Mr. Mbeki, is of course that he's been involved in most recently in a number of what what's the word, Tom? What's the word? Peccadillo. I think this is a generous way he's been involved in. He is a polygamist, and most recently, in the last 2-3 weeks, evidence has emerged that he's fathered yet another child out of wedlock. Now, I think that this is going to create a big crisis. I think President Zuma is in much deeper trouble than we think he is, because there's a sense of moral outrage now, which is emerging from people saying, how on earth can this go on? And the really interesting thing, and I didn't realize this until I read it the other day, in fact on the way here, the interesting thing is that people inside the ANC are just absolutely outraged about what has happened here. So I think the knives are probably out for the president. This raises the question of who could be, which people could conceivably be his successors. I think the successors, if they emerged, would emerge essentially from former members of the inside group, the internal group, the United Democratic Front or the Mass Democratic Movement. And there are a number of names which could possibly emerge. One is a man with the wonderful name of Tokyo Sekwali, Sex-A-L-E, that's the way it's spelled, S-E-X-A-L-E. Tokyo Sekwali, who's now a businessman, but a very charismatic man, and is now the Minister of Housing in the country as a possible person. Another person is Cyril Ramaphosa, who is the person who is singularly responsible for stitching up the deal with the Afrikaner leader, Rolf Meyer, for stitching up the deal. He's also gone to the business community. But the struggle is really about, where are the spoils of the exiles versus the exiles? And I think probably the moment has now come where this pattern of change will take place. So over the longer term, I think that there are promising leaders who can emerge inside the ANC, and certainly the country must hope that these leaders emerge. Let me turn a little bit to sociology and try to put this in a number of framings. Let me talk firstly about race, because when I was originally invited to talk, people asked me to talk about what is the race thing. For all its change, constitutional and political and economic, South Africa, little has really changed in the country in terms of race relations. I think that in many ways, the deep-seated antagonisms and the deep-seated fear that black people felt about the apartheid legislation, of course, has evaporated. But blacks remain essentially at the bottom of the pile. And the great challenge for South Africa is how to deal with this question of the representation of the voices of most black people in the highest offices in the land. So, whereas you do have the representation of blacks in places of power, their influence, I believe, is particularly limited. The ANC remains the dominant group, as I've tried to say, and the ANC has tried to be conscious to this racial sensitivity, has tried to be sensitive to this to the race question, and has, particularly under the presidency of Mr. Mbeki, tried to explain the country's racial dynamics in terms of economic issues. But I don't think that there has been a deep understanding of the explosiveness of the race issue in the country. Just in passing, we should note, of course, that there are other race groups in South Africa. South Africa has an Indian population from the subcontinent to roughly 1 million people, and a population of colored people, mestizos, roughly 3 million people in the Cape area, but they are now considered amongst the broad black community. Racially centered discourses continue to dominate the politics of the country, and in many ways these have become sharpened, I think, by the end of apartheid. The hope of the Rainbow Nation, Desmond Tutu's famous call that we should be a nation, a rainbow nation, remains a distant, but in my view, still a desirable dream. And it really is interesting because the students who come to the university, I think, are much more tolerant of each other's race dynamics. It's this educated group that are very much where the future lies. Students involved with each other in racial circumstances, in relationships across the race divide are important things, are important for the country's future. Let me say something about class, if I can. If anything, class relations have sharpened in the country. The consciousness of class has been heightened, I think, by the Black Diamonds sending their kids, for example, to private schools. So if you're in the inside group, if you're in this group that has benefited from black economic empowerment, the sense you've separated yourself in class terms from black people who were previously excluded. And South Africa, if you go to gated communities in South Africa, and much of the country has become gated communities in the cities, living in those gated communities are people in an upper class, and these upper classes are black and white living together. Let me say something about schooling, because I think this brings this class thing very much closer. Schooling and education remain, in my view, the country's biggest headache. The public school system is almost non-existent. South African class matriculation, that's the final year of schooling, remains the most terribly troubling situation. Every year, either we have the results have been tinkered with in some fashion or the other, or we understand that the mathematics papers are not up to standard. There's a continuous contestation over the school system. But the fact is this: the public school system has almost completely collapsed. And it's almost completely collapsed, and I think one has to face up and say this, and I have said this in the press and elsewhere. It's almost completely collapsed because the teachers have abandoned their professionalism. Not all, but the teachers' unions essentially have abandoned their professionalism. And this remains, I think, one of the deepest problems. 34 years after Soweto's children revolted in 1972, 34 years after Soweto's school children revolted, 76, I beg your pardon. 34 years after Soweto's school children revolted, this single issue of education has not been resolved. And I think one of the things that we have to face up to, part of the resolution has been that the embracing of neoliberal economics and thin democracy have meant that there's not been money for the improvement of the education system. So the way to send your kid to school and your kid to get a good education is to go to the private school system. The private school system is not only or exclusive. There are some fantastic success stories of people who have left the public school system and gone to establish small private schools in niche markets for black families. Policemen, small merchants, etc., have been able to get their kids into a private school system and use that private school system to leverage the kids into the universities. The knock-on effect, Madam President, you'll be interested in, I'm sure, is that the South African university system, and this is a continuous grind, is burdened with students coming into the university who are simply not prepared to be in the university. And I think that this is one of the greatest issues that the universities face, and we could have a conversation about this particular issue. Let me just touch on one little group in South Africa, because they were previously the bad guys. What has happened to the bad guys? The so-called Afrikaans community in the country, this group who are running South Africa. I think, and this is not a view held by everybody, I think they've emerged as the most adaptable and interesting group in the country. There is a group of people, roughly 3.5 million people, who were in power, who abandoned power, gave up power, and have seized the moment, I think, to reinvent themselves in quite significant ways. Let me give you one example. The person who is heading up the biggest mining house in Australia is an Afrikaans man. Still speaks Afrikaans in his house in Sydney and in his house in Hong Kong. These people have spread across the world, taking this extraordinary language with them and have adapted themselves as global citizens. I think it's one of the most interesting and fascinating stories of a people who have used, in a sense, what they were presented with, all of these values to try and reinvent themselves. Inside the country, they have also reinvented themselves. And a particularly important issue here is the fight for the Afrikaans language. It is a language of science, a language which has been deeply developed, has a sophisticated literature, and they've stopped teaching it in the universities. And I suspect there is going to be a huge contestation over the future of the Afrikaans language. Whether this translates into a fight again for Afrikaner identity is, I think, one of the great questions. Will Afrikaners use this as a fight to try and grab power back? My own inclination is they won't. My own inclination is that the dark moment of Afrikaner history is past. But in a little issue which I do think is interesting, if one looks at cultural production in South Africa, the biggest and most interesting part of cultural production comes from Afrikaans music, Afrikaans literature. This is absolutely booming. So these people have gone and attacked, in a sense, tried to understand their own position in society. Let me talk about two big issues before I turn to the question of the Constitution and law and end and allow you to ask some questions. Let me talk about two big issues. The first and most important one is the HIV/AIDS issue, and the second is crime. Let me say two things about HIV and AIDS. Three things. One is South Africa has the highest infection in the world. Secondly, this situation was completely exacerbated by, and I'll use the word here because I've used it elsewhere, by the narrow-mindedness, if not stupidity, of South Africa's former President, Thabo Mbeki. this issue. There are many explanations for this. I've written a paper on this topic, or tried to explain the Mbeki presidency. It was just a dark moment, and a completely irrational moment in the country's history. That said, the South African government has managed, and this is to its credit, to roll out an antiretroviral campaign, which is the largest in this world. So people who have the virus are getting, and it works, and it is efficient, are getting this drug, are getting the drugs that they need. And it is, I think, a great success story, particularly after Mbeki's complete neglect and abandonment, essentially, of this project by his, I think, stupidity over the issue. Let me turn to crime. Criminality and violence is rampant in the country. But I think we have to see this in a historical context, or in a comparative context, or if you like, a sociological context. This is a society in very deep transition, remains in very deep transition. And put that together with this gap between rich and poor, and I think one gets a much clearer picture that this is driven by these sociological factors. It's also, and I think one has to face it, it's also driven by the inadequacy and corruption in the police force. And the fact that police forces are, because wages are so low and professionalism is not fully developed, police forces are susceptible to be drawn in to making a quick buck. I think that there has been, in the last year or so, quite an interesting and positive response to the crime thing. I think that the Mbeki presidency allowed us to have a chief of police who was clearly corrupt, who was clearly involved with an international criminal and drug dealer. But President Zuma has appointed a man who is tough, uncompromising, and pretty much focused on the fact that the police force has to be professional. And as you know, in this country, it takes a long time to develop a professional police force. You know, particularly after you ended apartheid, essentially ended a police force and began again. 20 years is not a long time to develop this. So my sense is that South Africa is certainly, hopefully, winning the battle on the police. Let me end with the law and constitution, because for me, this is what matters the most. South Africa has a modern liberal constitution with full separation of powers. It is often called the most advanced constitution in the world. Now, these are big claims. Let me put three things on the table here, why people make this claim. Firstly, it's entirely embedded in human rights. I read the other day something at Tom Regel's house, something Jimmy Carter said that human rights didn't make the United States. The United States didn't make human rights made the United States. That was an interesting phrase, because there's no question that South Africa was made, this South Africa was made over the struggle of human rights, no question about it all. And this issue of human rights is embedded central, front and center in the country's constitution. There is no escaping the discourse around human rights. It is there for the world to see. Secondly, and this is symptomatic, it's the most gay-friendly constitution in the world. Gay-friendly constitution in the world. I mean, we don't have this stuff that you have in California. You can be married one day, you can't be married the next day, etc., etc. You can do the thing if you want to do it in South Africa. And it's fully recognized, and it is, you know, quite a, I mean, for essentially a conservative society in both white and black quarters to deal with this issue is a big issue. There is a little suggestion that people around Zuma are hostile to gays, but I think that the settling of the gay friendliness of the South African Constitution is absolutely written in golden ink, and I don't think it's there for the taking away. And thirdly, and I'll just slip this in because it's South Africa remains the only country in the world which has academic freedom in its constitution. Now, we can have 100 debates. I sat on a national panel trying to decide what this was. But I said, hey, look, they're giving us this thing. Why are we arguing about it? What does academic freedom mean, et cetera, but it's there in the Constitution. So these are three little things why people like to call themselves the most advanced constitution in the world. Hanging over this, or overhanging this, is a constitutional court. And this, for me, is the centerpiece and the hope for the entire country. This is much like your Supreme Court and the German Constitutional Court. This is a court that deliberates over the matters of the Constitution and all other matters in the country if brought in terms of the Constitution. And they have made truly courageous rulings against the state. At times they've bended towards the state, but they have made truly some very courageous rulings. One of the heads of the Constitutional Court is a man that both Tom and I know, Arthur Chaskelson, and they've made really significant rulings about this. And this, for me, is the hope. The appointments to the Constitutional Court have been largely, almost entirely, and I'm happy to say this with a smile on my face in front of an American audience, free of political interference. Now, of course, the great question is, if the ANC gets 66.6% of the Constitution, they can change it, and the fear is that they will change it. At the last election last year, they just narrowly missed that. But my sense, even with Zuma and even with Mbeki, is this is the thing they will not touch. Now, this may be the wish being the father to the thought, but I think the Constitutional Court is the greatest single hope that we've got, this Constitutional Court. South Africa is a country subject to the rule of the law, and I think this is central to the future of the country. So in sum, ladies and gentlemen, let me say, we have gone from, in the past 15 years, from the exceptionalism of our transition to patterns of politics which mark every country in the world. The politics which is the struggle for resources. And that is the nature of contemporary politics everywhere. It's a struggle for resources. Secondly, politics remain essentially in the realm of elites. But the major transformation of the country remains to be done. Is South Africa a democracy? Yes. Is it a functioning democracy? Yes. Is it a near one-party state? Yes. But I'm always reminded of it's so difficult to judge a thing after 20 years. And when I think about the United States, I think of 4 moments in the United States. Forgive me if I get this wrong. From the revolution to the Civil War, from the Civil War to Rosa Parks, from Rosa Parks to Barack Obama, what is it, 230 odd years? This is a long journey you've taken. Your journey is not over. It's a much longer journey than the 20 years that we've been involved. So what is Professor Vale's grading of South Africa in this period? I think probably a C+, C minus. Not a bad record for 20 years.